Hey guys, welcome to our discussion of the origins of the new nation. This is lecture 1C. These are the topics that we're going to go over today. We are going to look at an example of federalism as we start to compare the government that the Constitution set up with modern contemporary issues. Federalism is a topic that has been debated for centuries. So we'll look at an example of federalism. We'll get into what philosophies led to the revolution, what challenges did the Articles of Confederation present, and finally, what happened at the Constitutional Convention. So let's get started with a modern-day example of federalism. Federalism, as you're going to find out in Chapter 3, is the division of power between the national government and subnational governments, state and local governments. And there's always a debate about where the power should lie. Should the national government be in control of most of the functions of government, or should those functions be left to the states? So here's an example that illustrates that debate really well. It concerns the 26th Amendment, which is voting age. So it's the campaign to lower the voting age is what started the 26th Amendment. It started a long time ago. That's something else you're going to learn about, how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. So starting with World War II, the idea that those who are 18 years of age, if you're old enough to fight, you should also be old enough to vote. And with World War II, that idea gained popularity. In 1954, Eisenhower endorsed the idea in his State of the Union. LBJ and Nixon both supported the idea too. With the Vietnam War, the campaign took on more of a sense of urgency with the slogan, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So Congress passed legislation that lowered, this is a congressional law, that lowered the voting age in national, state, and local elections to 18. However, Oregon challenged the law, saying the Constitution did not give Congress the authority to establish voting ages in local and state elections. Those are functions of the states. So Congress did not have the authority to tell the states that they had to lower the voting age to 18 with the way the Constitution was written. And the Supreme Court agreed with Oregon. So that decision left a very bizarre scenario where in some states, those who are 18 could vote in national elections, but they wouldn't be able to vote in state and local elections. So because Congress realized they needed to act on that, they quickly passed an amendment to the Constitution, which became the 26th Amendment. But that example shows the different types of powers that are involved, state and national powers that are involved in elections, which are mostly a function of the state. So let's get into the origins of a new nation. The United States is now, we're starting out with the United States still being a colony of Britain. And again, this is not really a history class, so we're not going to focus too much on the historical events of the revolution, but more the development of American government. So Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, argued for independence. And Common Sense inspired Richard Henry Lee of Virginia to call for independence, which was an act of treason. And that call was a call for a confederation, which is a type of government where the national government derives its power from the states. And the states are basically a league of independent states. That led to the Declaration of Independence, which was drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, that proclaimed the right of the American colonies to separate from Great Britain. Jefferson wrote about the reasons for independence, and Jefferson, as a Southerner, was added to the group of philosophers, politicians who were coming up with the Declaration of Independence to add a geographical balance, so it wasn't so much all Northerners. And in it, Jefferson borrowed heavily from Locke's two treatises of government and the social contract theory, which we've mentioned before, the idea that government exists based on the consent of the governed, and that people agree to leave that state of nature, this state of nature, and agree to be governed largely for the protection of their property. So people consent to being governed to protect property. And in a lot of writings that are based around this colonial time, property comes up a lot. And in this sense, property includes all things like life, liberty, and material possessions. Also, in the social contract theory, those who give their consent to be governed have the right to resist or remove rulers who deviate from creating a good government. So rebellion is the ultimate sanction against a government that has violated the rights of its citizens. So we get into the first attempt at government in the United States, and that is the Articles of Confederation, which was a very tricky thing to write because the people who wrote the Articles of Confederation had to codify arrangements that had never been put into legal terminology before. The compact, it is a compact among the 13 original states, and it was the basis of their government. It was written in 1776 at a time of war, but it was not ratified. The articles were not ratified until 1781. So, again, it created a type of government that was a confederation, where the states considered themselves independent nation states linked together only for limited purposes. The states were stronger than the national government. It did create a national government with a Congress that could make peace, coin money, appoint officers for an army, control the post office, negotiate with Indian tribes. Each state had ultimate authority within its own territory. It was also very difficult to change. Each state had one vote in the Continental Congress, regardless of how big the state was. 9 out of 13 votes were needed to pass any measure. To amend the articles, there had to be a unanimous vote. The state legislators selected and paid their representatives. And there was no unifying force to hold all the states together after the war. So the Articles of Confederation led to a lot of problems. There was a huge reluctance on the part of the states to give power to the national government. There's much more loyalty to the states at the time. And that brings us into the critical period, which is a time from 1781 to 1789. Congress could rarely even get a quorum to meet. They needed 9, and they often had a hard time getting 9 to attend. There was little agreement, especially on taxes. There was a huge war debt after the Revolutionary War, but Congress couldn't raise taxes to pay off the debt. Congress could coin money, but it was worthless. States began coining their own money, which added to the confusion of having so many different currencies. Congress could not regulate commerce. Individual states began entering into agreements with other countries, which was also very chaotic. There's also no executive to enforce laws. The political leaders were fearful of a tyrannical leader at the time. There was a president, whose name was John Hanson, but his job was only to preside over the Congress. Some trivia buffs might refer to him as the first president of the United States. There's no judiciary to rule on disagreements between states. For example, Pennsylvania and Virginia went to war. There was disputes over borders. There's no strong government, a central government. That was perhaps the biggest weakness in the Articles, that it did not create a strong central government. Many states violated the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. For example, states passed laws that did not pay back debts to Great Britain, did not give property back to those who were sympathetic to the British, and both of those things violated the Treaty of Paris. So many leaders began calling for a stronger national government. It became obvious that the United States needed a stronger national government that the Articles of Confederation did not provide. And then one example just drove home that point that a stronger national government was needed, and that event is Shays' Rebellion. It's a dramatic example in 1780 of the national government's failure to organize. Massachusetts adopted a constitution that appeared to favor the interests of the wealthy. The lower class who owned no property could not vote or hold office. Banks foreclosed on farms of many Massachusetts Continental Army veterans. In 1786, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law requiring that all debts be paid in cash. This led Daniel Shays and about 1,500 other disgruntled vets to march on Springfield, Massachusetts. Massachusetts and the U.S. couldn't raise funds to put down the rebellion. Congress appropriated the money, but every state except Virginia denied it. The state militia in Massachusetts also could not afford to put down the rebellion. So a good way to sum up Shays' rebellion is a 1786 rebellion in which an army of 1,500 disgruntled and angry farmers, led by Daniel Shays, marched to Springfield, Massachusetts, and forcibly restrained the state court from foreclosing mortgages on their farms. And that just drove home the point that the national government was weak under the Articles of Confederation and wasn't able to function. And that led to calls to create a stronger national government. And that is where the Constitutional Convention comes in, the 1787 meeting in Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. Now, there were competing plans when the delegates met in Philadelphia on May 25th, 1778. The Virginia Plan, which was mostly the work of James Madison and was presented by Edmund Randolph, consisted of 15 resolutions that would create an entirely new government. And the New Jersey Plan, created by William Patterson, took greater steps to preserve the Articles. But before we get to those two plans, let's look at the Founding Fathers. There were 74 delegates selected by their state legislatures. The work was done primarily behind closed doors at the Constitutional Convention. George Washington was elected as the presiding officer. He wanted to keep everything under wraps. That was tough for Ben Franklin, especially when liquor was involved at evening meals. It was hard to keep Ben Franklin from spilling the beans about what was happening at the meetings. The Founding Fathers were all men. They're mostly young, in their 20s and 30s, with a few exceptions, like Ben Franklin. There were many slave owners among the framers, and among the framers there was a vast political, educational, legal, and business experience. This group represented the elite. So for the elitists, this is an argument that American government is elite. So they worked on a constitution, which is a document establishing the structure, functions, and limitations of a government. Now, there are many theories about the motives of the framers. Charles A. Beard, a political scientist, has a famous one that says the framers were businessmen who feared for their economic interests with a weak national government. So Beard's argument is that the Constitution protected the property interests of the framers. Some suggest the framers were more interested in maintaining social order, and others say the framers supported order and stability over more radical ideas that had inspired the Revolution in the first place. Now, getting into those two plans that I mentioned a second ago, the Virginia Plan is the populous state plan. It's the plan for the big states. The Virginia Plan is the first general plan for the Constitution proposed by James Madison. Its key points were a bicameral legislature with one house based on population and one on equal representation, elected directly by the people. It had an executive who was chosen by the legislature and a judiciary which was also named by the legislature. And also the national legislature could veto any state law. So the Virginia Plan is a large state plan, and it's also the strong national government plan. There was also the New Jersey Plan, which is a framework for the Constitution proposed by a group of small states. Its key points were a one-house legislature with one vote for each state, the establishment of the acts of Congress as the supreme law of the land, and a supreme judiciary with limited power. It strengthened the Articles of Confederation. It did not replace them, like the Virginia Plan would have. It had one house legislature with one vote per state, regardless of size. And the Supreme Court members were appointed for life by the executive officers. So there had to be a compromise between these two competing plans. And the compromise that gets worked out is called the Great Compromise. It's also called the Connecticut Compromise. It's a decision made during the Constitutional Convention to give each state the same number of representatives in the Senate, regardless of the size of the state, and representation in the House was determined by population. The House gets to originate all bills for raising and spending money, all revenue bills. That's the phrase, the House controls the purse strings. So the theory was, in dividing power between the national and state governments, national power would be supreme, and at every step, at every level, the founders built in checks and balances with a separation of power. So this solved the representation debate, but there were a few other issues that the framers had to solve at the Constitutional Convention. And one of those issues was slavery. How would slaves be counted for population purposes? This was a very tricky issue at the convention, and the compromise that was agreed to was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. It was an agreement reached at the convention stipulating that each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining population for representation in the House of Representatives. The Southerners agreed to give the Senate more power in exchange for this compromise. The word slave never appears in the Constitution, but it is mentioned in a couple other places. Slavery could not be banned by Congress until 1808, so Congress couldn't address slavery until 1808, and escaped slaves would be returned to their master. And continuing with some disagreements that had to be worked out at the Constitutional Convention, we will get into those in our next presentation. Thank you for your attention. Hope that helped, and good luck studying.